we're going to step back a little bit and pick up where we left off in some of the earlier discussions about AI for government. And in this context, I'd like to draw your attention to a book that Michael Dukakis and his colleagues are putting together on the theory, pragmatics, and maybe possibly implementation of AI for government. So what I'd like to do, where does this work? Right?
Yes.
Is that you? If not, I can do without it, just talk to you.
No.
Okay. So, we have an issue. We have an issue here that has three parts to it. We have the AI part, we have the government part, and we have the challenge of connecting between the two, and then asking ourselves, well, where are we going with this? So my comments are presented in those three parts. So what's interesting about what we're doing here is that we recognize that the context that we are now in is a context in which we know much more about government. We've all had some course on government, some experience with government and so forth. Then we know about AI. And because it's a relatively recent part of our reality, by our, I mean the relatively educated community, the connection between AI and its uses for government becomes really an important challenge. So related to this is early on, we have to recognize that the world is a very different place. There are many diverse perspectives, countries, capabilities, and so forth. And it's very difficult to come up with general principles of performance and behavior in a world that's as diverse as it is, but we know we can do it because we've done it before. So let me go on now and start with the AI side. And I'm just selecting those. The outline was for my own good so that I stay on target. There's some aspects of AI that we would consider really basic now and for our purpose today. One is the near ubiquity. What is this? Well, let's see if we can do this down. Yes, that's the outline I wanted to work with. And we're at number 2, having to do with, let's look at AI, power and pitfalls for our purpose. So we've done that. I'm sorry, on the context, a reminder of the differences in capabilities. And I picked up robots because they're fun. And this is a reminder of the diversity of the world that we live in, and that we have to remember that the freedoms of whatever capability we're talking about is varied throughout the international system. And that's part of the context that we're dealing with. So now we turn to AI. You know all of this, but each one of those carries some important implication. We know that there's near ubiquity in the use of AI in almost all aspects of industrial societies. And we know that many forms, manifestations, etc. We also know that there's a very diverse technical community. And then when we talk about ethics of AI, we recognize that usually, with the exception of our first speaker, scientists and technicians working in AI don't have ethics as a primary objective. They just want the machine to work and to do something interesting. It's not part of their job description. But there are two important aspects of the AI world that are absolutely fundamental for our purpose. One pertains to data, and the other pertains to algorithms. And I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't know, but I do want to remind you that in AI applications, data is usually embedded. And it's very difficult to get a handle on really what is a database, not really transparent, unlike usual statistical applications where you know what the source is and so forth. This is kind of important Because if data, which is what we expect, will be relevant to AI for government, then we have to have a sense of whose data, how is it embedded, etc., etc. The issue of algorithm is more interesting and more complex. There are values embedded in algorithms. I never thought of an algorithm as having values. I was so grateful that the algorithm works, whatever algorithm I was using. Still think about the value part of the implications. Values embedded in the then we are carrying not only uncertainties, but a set of values that whose content we may not know enough. Now, for most industrial applications, probably values don't matter. Just get the thing going, and that's all that matters, as long as the plane doesn't crash where it finds shape. But in the domain of government or governance, values become very important if they're embedded in algorithms. And at that point, the issue of transparency becomes important. And it's kind of thorny because the last thing we want to do as non-AI creators and technicians is to delve into algorithms. We want to be able to have a sense of what's going on without having to become really an expert in the area. This raises the question of where are artificial intelligence innovations happening? I can't vouch for this, but I found it very interesting because of the gradations and of the places that stand out as having high innovation. I was a little bit surprised at the distribution of the dark colors, but this is just as a reminder of the diversity in which we're operating. Now let's turn to government. And without doing a play on words, government is the mechanism through which governance operates. And the AI for government brings out the, one more time, the diversity that we're dealing with. This is the distribution of in countries by degree of economic freedom. Diversity. Now, the message here is the greens are the good guys and open, and the darker colors are not, in terms of control of government of economic activities. This has nothing to do with efficiency, or performance, or anything. It's just that element. And the reason this is important is that it's really relevant to remain in touch with the realities that we're dealing with when we talk about general principles of government to which we want AI to help us. So standard political scientists think of government as having to deal with the stress or the ratio between the loads on it and its capabilities to perform functions. And there is some kind of consensus among political scientists that at the generic level, not the specific institutional level, but the generic level, for a government to be operationally effective, it has to have a set of capabilities which are listed here. This comes from Almond and Power, published in 1966, but provided us with a framework. So if we are applying AI to government functions, these are the generic functions. I've added security because they hadn't introduced it there. And we're familiar with each one of these. It's just written listed in a generic, not operational, not idiosyncratic term. So with that, we keep in mind that whatever governments have to do or want to do or can do, have the capacities to do, there's something else that we really have to consider, and that is the matter of rules. Rules have to be made, have to be communicated, They have to have agencies to implement them, and on and on and on. At the operational level, then, the interface between AI and the government capabilities becomes the scotch tape that keeps them both together. Moving on to the connections, the AI and government. I started with some comments on AI, and then I moved on to some comments on government. And a reminder that the gains to government from AI are generally thought of, more efficiency, more consistency, better monitoring, and better possibilities of alignment in performance and goals, plus lots of others. This is just a reminder. Now, here is a rather interesting situation having to do with the potential limitations of AI as we understand it, we being the social scientists for governance. We're very good at analysis and targeting using those logics and those technologies. But it's not clear that AI provides us assistance with interpretation of rules, regulations, etc. I'm pushing this tentatively because I think of that as a possible limitation, and I hope you can tell me that I'm really wrong. The second possible limitation is as very good at execution of tasks, meeting a target, meeting multiple targets. But not much work has been done on meeting a target and considering the consequences. For the government part, this may very well be relevant, important. Consequences create problems if we don't anticipate them, at least think about anticipating them. And now we put the two pieces together, which is AI for government explicitly. And what I want to do, what I would like to do, I really am almost done, is remind you of the experience we've gone through with the internet. We've had very interesting developments in our experience with the internet on architecture, on governance, and on technology. And I want to go through 1, 2, 3, because jointly, all three help us think about what can we learn for applications to government. We now know that the values that those are constructed, designed, developed the protocols for the operation of the internet drove the architecture. The architecture was designed for open systems, for reach. It was designed for extensive massive communication. It was not designed for high security. It was not designed for lots of other properties that we now think are important. And we are now recognizing the relationship between the problems we now have, some problems we now have, we should call cybersecurity, and the architecture of the system. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have done a different architecture. What I am suggesting is that the relationship is important. And I also want to values in architecture and values, but I also want to draw your attention to the fact that NSF has completed a few years ago a large study about alternatives to our current architecture. So we're already thinking about, what can we do about that. Second lesson that comes from our experience with the internet is distributed governance for that particular technology, for that particular internet. Distributed governance is not standard in our textbook on government. Textbook on government is usually hierarchical, blah, 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 blah. But we don't value and we don't articulate what that might be. And yet we have constructed a global system whose properties are in fact of a distributed nature, and we're all dependent on each other. But what this does, that's very relevant, is that authority in that case comes from performance. So performance is a check on whether you're legitimate or not, whether there's authority or not. And then the third and last lesson or experience or insight you might get from the internet situation has to do with technology specifically. And that is the innovations in distributed interactions for a particular purpose that we now call, example is the public ledger. Transparent, overt, available, possibly very scalable, and may have potential for how to democratize. Now, we're not sure that a distributed public ledger works for all functions we're interested in, but we've never had this experience before. We've never had the possibility of running activities that we consider valued, Bitcoin, etc., in that domain, in that area, and it may not scale well, but it's operational. So what does all this amount to? It amounts to bits and pieces of what we might want to seriously consider when we begin to think of the prototypes of AI for government. So this brings us to some imperatives. All of this you're familiar with: responsibility, accountability, and performance, blah 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 blah. And the point of how can I go back? Yeah, no. The 3 points here that are not part of the usual. One more. Yeah, right here. We usually think about AI for something, but we may very well have to think about the provision of human oversight. It doesn't undermine the technological imperatives and the technological underpinning, but I, for one, am not comfortable enough to eliminate the human oversight. I'm not quite sure how it's to be done, but so then there are 2 footnotes here. So far, I haven't used the word feedback, and I don't think that the previous speaker also mentioned the word feedback. But in a government context, the feedback relation, the feedback dynamics between the demands on government and pressures on government and the potential corrective mechanisms by government, that feedback loop is one in which we could possibly be able to innovate improved responsiveness by government. And then the last point is it is imperative that we find ways of preventing the excessive centralized control of any entity in the use of AI for governance. So, what does this see? What next? Where are we going from here? A reminder. In the world out there, there really is something akin to what we used to call an arms race. It's a competition, global competition for AI-related leadership. And this is true of our generation, but when the next generation is really trained in AI comes up, we're expected to see an acceleration of this. This is my last slide. It's back to robots again. And what we don't see here is the usual north-south cleavage in capability, and we don't see, we see some surprises. I did not expect Singapore and Korea to be more dominant in robot density than the United States. And I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but I do want to add that diversity is also manifested at the technical, at the operational level. So, to conclude all this, I suggest that we may want to think about these bits and pieces that I've shared with you as elements that have to be taken into account if and when there is serious international discussion about a global accord on, or treaty on the management of AI and respect for the